Vegas woman with local connections is accused of shooting her adult son in the neck. Linda Cooney is facing attempted murder charges and is set to appear in court in February. Cooney once lived in Juno Beach. She was acquitted in 1993 of murder charges after shooting her ex-husband to death.
Imagine a gun that kills someone in your family gets locked away as evidence, gets acquitted right alongside the woman who fired it, and then, 20 years later, somehow ends up back in her house. Not a replacement, not a similar model, the same weapon. And this time, instead of an ex-husband, the person on the other end of the barrel is her own son. That isn't a metaphor, and it isn't a coincidence anyone could believe by accident. A woman shoots her ex-husband dead in front of their 10-year-old child, walks free after a trial, and 2 decades later, with that exact same revolver, her adult son ends up shot in the neck in her living room. 2 shootings, 1 shooter, 1 gun, and a family that spent 20 years insisting every single time that none of it was really her fault. Hit subscribe right now because this story only gets darker from here. And while you're at it, a like helps this reach more people, and a comment tells me you're paying attention. Now let's get into it. This is the story of Linda Cooney, a .357 Magnum that should have never left an evidence locker, and the 2 men in her life who both nearly died in front of her, 20 years apart. Jim Cooney was, by every account of the people who knew him, a genuinely well-liked man. He worked as a tax attorney in Palm Beach, Florida, part of a large and prominent local family, the eldest of 8 children. Palm Beach in the 1970s and 80s was a small, tightly wound social world, and the Cooneys were fixtures in it. Jim wasn't the type of person you'd expect to end up at the center of a homicide investigation. He was, from everything available in the public record, simply a working professional trying to build a life. Linda Cooney came from somewhere entirely different, a family farm in Wisconsin, a long way from the manicured social scene of South Florida. She eventually made her way to Palm Beach and found work as a legal secretary, and it was there, at a party, that she met Jim. They eloped in 1979, and photographs from a few years later show them at a Hawaiian-themed event at the Breakers Hotel, looking, at least on the surface, like any other young Palm Beach couple building a life together. They had 2 sons. Kevin was born in 1981, and Christopher followed in 1983, and according to nearly everyone who later spoke about the marriage, it was troubled almost from the start. After 9 years together, following a reported incident of domestic battery, Jim and Linda divorced, and what followed was an ugly, drawn-out custody dispute. Jim wanted more time with his sons. Linda, according to people close to the family, wanted more money. Jim's brother, Bob Cooney, would later describe a disturbing pattern where Jim would show up for his scheduled weekend visits only to find the boys weren't there. Unless, as Bob put it, Jim was willing to hand over some cash first. It's worth pausing on how ordinary that pattern probably looked from the outside at the time. Custody disputes involving money and scheduling friction are common enough that most people who knew the Cooneys likely assumed this was simply a bitter garden-variety divorce, 2 parents who couldn't agree, playing tug-of-war with visitation as leverage. Nobody in Palm Beach society, as far as the record shows, seemed to imagine it as anything more dangerous than that. Jim kept showing up. He kept trying. Whatever friction existed between him and Linda, he never stopped wanting time with his sons, and that, more than anything else, is what makes the morning of February 7, 1992, so hard to sit with. That pattern was still playing out on February 7, 1992, when Jim Cooney arrived at Linda's house to pick up Kevin and Christopher for a weekend visit. The boys went to their room to pack, and through a small gap in the bedroom door, 10-year-old Kevin looked out and saw something in his father's hand as Jim walked down the hallway toward them. Investigators later said Kevin couldn't be sure what it was. It might have been a key. It might have been a knife. He simply didn't know. What happened next, Kevin watched happen. His mother shot his father with a .357 Magnum revolver as Jim walked into the front hallway. 3 shots. Kevin ran to call the police himself while his mother, in the chaos of the moment, tried instead to reach a friend who happened to be a lawyer. It was only when she realized her own son was already on the phone with 911 that she grabbed it from him, hysterical, telling the dispatcher, "I shot at him. I don't know if I got him or not." Linda Cooney was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Her defense was self-defense. She claimed Jim had come at her with a knife. Investigators, however, developed a very different theory, that Linda had placed a knife in Jim's hand after the shooting to stage the scene, and that she had shaped her young son's account of what he saw through the door to match that story. In 1993, 11-year-old Kevin Cooney took the stand at his mother's murder trial. He testified that his father had something with what he called a glary shine in his hand. He never said, on the record, that he actually saw a knife, but the implication landed exactly where it needed to. Linda Cooney was acquitted. Almost immediately after the trial, Linda packed up her sons and left Florida entirely, resettling the family in Las Vegas. A local columnist who covered Palm Beach society at the time, Jose Lambiet, later put it simply. She understood that a city like Vegas doesn't ask many questions about where you came from or what you left behind. For the better part of 2 decades, the Cooneys lived what looked, from the outside, like an ordinary life in the Las Vegas suburbs. But underneath that surface, something else was happening. Between 1996 and 2011, police were called to the Cooney household for family disturbances more than once. A quiet, recurring pattern that never seemed to escalate into anything the public heard about, until it did. That's often how these patterns survive for so long. A disturbance call doesn't make headlines. It doesn't get investigated as part of a larger pattern unless someone is specifically looking for one, and nobody had any reason to connect a handful of scattered calls at a suburban Las Vegas addressed to a murder acquittal that had happened in a different state, under a different jurisdiction, 2 decades earlier. The system, in a very real sense, wasn't built to notice a slow-burning pattern like this one until it produced another body, or in this case, another gunshot wound. Kevin grew into adulthood with an unusual creative streak. He built elaborate costumes, including detailed Transformer suits, and won prize money at costume competitions around Las Vegas. It's a small, almost disarming detail in the middle of a story this dark, but it matters, because it's a reminder that Kevin Cooney wasn't defined only by what was happening at home. He had hobbies. He had wins. He had an identity outside of his mother's house, even while, according to people who dated him, he lived under an almost suffocating degree of control from her. In 2008, Kevin began dating a woman named Clarita Kendall. Prosecutors would later describe a consistent pattern. Whenever either of Linda's sons started seeing someone seriously, Linda would move to end it the moment she felt she was losing her grip on them. Kendall said Kevin spent much of the relationship trying to shield her from his mother entirely, keeping her presence in his life as hidden as he could manage. By 2011, Kevin was seeing someone new, Karina Taylor, a rising competitor in the Las Vegas mixed martial arts scene. It didn't take long before Linda started calling and harassing Taylor directly. Taylor later said Kevin had warned her early on that his mother had a history with his past girlfriends, and that she could be, in Taylor's word, difficult in ways that went beyond ordinary parental disapproval. One of the prosecutors on the eventual criminal case, Shannon Clowers, put it more bluntly. Linda's goal was to make any woman in Kevin's life miserable enough that she'd simply leave on her own. Then came June 28, 2011. Just after 8:30 in the morning, Linda Cooney called Las Vegas police, sounding frantic. Her 30-year-old son Kevin was on the living room floor in a pool of blood, shot in the neck. As paramedics rushed him to the hospital, Kevin told first responders before losing consciousness that the shooting had been an accident. When investigators sat down with Linda afterward, her account was strange in ways that immediately drew attention. She told them she and Kevin had argued that night over his relationship with Karina Taylor, that Kevin had hit her during the fight, and that things had eventually calmed down enough for her to fall asleep on the couch. She said she woke around 8, got up for a glass of water, heard Kevin calling her name, and found him already on the ground with a gunshot wound. What she couldn't explain, what she insisted, almost pointedly, again and again, was that she never actually heard the gun go off. One of the detectives on the case, Lance Landholm, later said her demeanor gave him the distinct impression of someone actively trying to cover something up. Investigators recovered the weapon lying wrapped in a towel nearby. It was a .357 Magnum. It was, when they ran it, the exact same revolver Linda had used to kill Jim Cooney nearly 20 years earlier, a gun she had apparently retrieved from evidence storage after her acquittal and kept in the family home ever since. Prosecutor Shannon Clowers would later say what most people watching the case unfold were probably already thinking. You'd expect a weapon tied to that kind of trauma to be the last thing anyone would ever want to see again, let alone keep in their living room for the next 2 decades. There was another detail that echoed uncomfortably from 1992. Just like in Palm Beach, Linda's very first call after the shooting wasn't to 911. It was to her other son, Christopher, who by then was working as a Las Vegas police officer himself. That call lasted almost 16 minutes before anyone contacted emergency services. Prosecutor Clowers would later argue that the delay itself said something, that it suggested Linda wasn't in any hurry for Kevin to get help in time. 3 days after the shooting, Kevin woke up at the hospital partially paralyzed, and prosecutors say the very first words out of his mouth, repeated afterward to multiple nurses, were that he was afraid of his mother and that she had shot him. Linda Cooney was arrested for the attempted murder of her own son on September 16, 2011. But the case wasn't simple after that. 4 months later, prosecutors watched Kevin's account shift again, this time away from blaming his mother entirely. He began telling a different version, one where he had attacked Linda, where the two of them struggled over the gun, and where it discharged by accident during that struggle. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define the entire trial that followed. A victim who, once conscious and reunited with his family, seemed determined to protect the person prosecutors believed had shot him. On April 8, 2014, more than 20 years after walking free from a murder charge, Linda Cooney was back in a courtroom, this time for the opening arguments of her attempted murder trial. Prosecutors laid out a theory centered on control, that Kevin had wanted to move out and move on with his life, and that Linda, unwilling to lose her grip on him, had shot him rather than let him leave. The defense told a very different story, that Kevin, worn down by his mother's constant interference in his relationships, had finally snapped, that the two of them had struggled physically over the gun, and that it had gone off entirely by accident in the middle of that struggle. Kevin's younger brother, Christopher, took the stand for the prosecution. He described the frantic, disjointed phone call he'd received from his mother right after the shooting, how he'd tried, over and over, to get a straight answer out of her about where Kevin had been hit and what had actually happened, and how she simply hadn't been able to give him one. Christopher also testified that before the trial, Linda had privately told him her version of events, that the loaded .357 was kept out on the living room floor for home protection, that she believed Kevin was reaching for it, that she grabbed it first and tried to run for the door, and that Kevin pried it away from her right before it went off. It's an uncomfortable position for any sibling to be placed in, a police officer himself, testifying against his own mother, using details she had told him privately, in a case where his brother was both the victim, and by then, actively working to undermine the prosecution's case from the stand. Christopher's testimony didn't just supply facts. It quietly established, without ever saying so directly, that Linda had been rehearsing and refining her account of the shooting well before she ever had to give it under oath. The judge allowed prosecutors to tell the jury something that would end up shaping the entire case, that this wasn't the first time Linda Cooney had shot someone with this exact weapon, and that 20 years earlier in Florida, she had been acquitted after killing her ex-husband with it. Kevin testified twice. The first time was by video from his hospital bed, where he described an almost inverted family dynamic, framing himself, not his mother, as the one who called the shots at home, going as far as to say that if his mother didn't do what he told her, she'd face consequences from him. Prosecutors saw it as an extreme, almost self-sabotaging attempt to protect Linda by making himself look like the aggressor in the household. He said the gun had discharged as he tried to wrestle it out of her hands, firing upward. That claim ran directly into a problem, though a problem made of physics rather than testimony. The surgeon who had operated on Kevin, Dr. John Fildes, testified for the state that the bullet's path through his neck was actually angled slightly downward and to the left. It directly contradicted Kevin's account of an upward-firing gun during a struggle. Then came the moment prosecutors had been building toward. Kevin's ex-girlfriend, Clarita Kendall, testified that she'd gone to see him not long after the shooting, and that in that conversation, he never once described it as an accident. Instead, she said, he told her he'd simply been sitting on the couch when he was shot, an account that lined up precisely with the downward bullet trajectory the medical evidence had already established. Called back to testify in person as a defense witness after that, Kevin changed his account of the angle again, this time describing the shot as downward rather than upward. Falling in line, at last, with what the forensic evidence had already made undeniable. To the prosecution, it was simply further proof of how far Kevin was willing to bend his own testimony to keep protecting his mother. The jury didn't buy the accident story. Linda Cooney was convicted of attempted murder, along with battery with a deadly weapon, intimidating Kevin before his testimony, and stalking his former girlfriend, Karina Taylor. One of the defense attorneys on the case later said that once the jury learned what had happened in Florida 2 decades earlier, the outcome was probably decided right then. Nearly 3 months after the verdict, Linda Cooney returned to court for sentencing. Kevin wasn't there, but he sent a written statement insisting his mother had been wrongly convicted, that it was his own actions that had led to his condition, and that she was, in his words, unjustly incarcerated. Linda spoke for herself as well, telling the judge that Kevin carried an anger and rage disorder she believed he'd inherited from his father, that she had only ever protected and loved him, and that what happened was ultimately his fault. An accident, she insisted, before asking the court for mercy. The judge sentenced her to 13 to 40 years in prison. Technical analysis. What makes this case so instructive from an investigative standpoint is the way physical, forensic evidence eventually overrode 2 versions of testimony that both came from the same traumatized, conflicted witness. Kevin Cooney changed his account of the shooting multiple times, first calling it an accident at the scene, then blaming his mother directly once he regained consciousness away from her influence, then revering again months later once he was back in contact with his family, then revering the specific mechanics of his story once more on the stand. In a case with that much movement in a single witness's memory, verbal testimony alone becomes almost useless as a reliable foundation. What didn't move was the bullet's actual path through Kevin's body. Dr. Fildes's trajectory testimony, a downward angle, not the upward angle Kevin initially described under oath, gave prosecutors a fixed point that no amount of witness uncertainty could shift. It's a pattern worth remembering in any case involving a victim who has strong emotional incentive to protect or shield the person who harmed them. Physical evidence doesn't have loyalties, and it doesn't change its story between an initial statement and a hospital bed. The second technical thread running through this case is the role of prior act evidence. Under normal circumstances, a 20-year-old acquittal wouldn't necessarily be relevant to an unrelated criminal trial, but the judge's decision to let jurors hear that the same weapon had been used in an earlier killing fundamentally reframed how the entire case was understood. It transformed what might have looked, on paper, like an ambiguous domestic struggle into part of a pattern spanning 2 decades and 2 victims. That ruling arguably did more to shape the trial's outcome than any single piece of testimony that followed it. Finally, there's the matter of timing in emergency response. In both 1992 and 2011, Linda Cooney's first phone call after a shooting wasn't to 911. It was to someone else entirely, a personal contact, before emergency services were ever notified. In 2011 specifically, that call to her other son lasted nearly 16 minutes before police were involved. Response time analysis like this often ends up mattering less for what it proves definitively, and more for what it suggests about a person's priorities in the immediate aftermath of a shooting they claim was accidental. There's a fifth thread here too, one that's less about physical evidence and more about how investigators have learned to weigh testimony from a witness who is also, functionally, still inside the influence of the person they might be protecting. Kevin Cooney was interviewed and re-interviewed across a period of months, and his account moved every single time his circumstances changed: hospital bed, home recovery, courtroom. Investigators and prosecutors in cases like this have increasingly come to treat a witness's very first spontaneous statement, made before there's been any opportunity for outside contact or reflection, as carrying disproportionate weight precisely because it hasn't yet been filtered through loyalty, fear, or family pressure. That's part of why Kevin's first words after regaining consciousness, nomming his mother directly, before he'd had any real conversation with her again, carried as much weight as they ultimately did in front of the jury, regardless of everything he said afterward to walk it back. Psychological analysis. At the center of this case is a specific, recognizable pattern of control that extended across 2 generations of the same family. Prosecutors described Linda actively working to end her son's romantic relationships whenever she felt she was losing influence over them, first with Clarita Kendall, then more aggressively with Karina Taylor. That kind of behavior, sustained over years and across multiple relationships, doesn't typically emerge out of a single argument. It tends to reflect a long-standing need for control over the people closest to her, one that both of her sons appear to have organized much of their adult lives around managing. What's especially striking here is Kevin's own behavior after the shooting, not once but repeatedly, choosing to protect his mother even at direct cost to his own case, his own credibility, and arguably his own physical account of what had happened to his own body. His first statements, made in the immediate rawness of nearly dying and before he'd had any real contact with his family again, were the most consistent and the most damning: fear and a direct accusation. Everything that came afterward, once he was back within his mother's orbit, moved in the opposite direction. That shift is a pattern trauma researchers and investigators both recognize: statements made in the first moments after a crisis, before a victim has had time to be influenced, reassured, or pressured by people close to them, tend to carry more evidentiary weight precisely because they haven't yet been shaped by anyone else's version of events. There's also something worth sitting with in the fact that Linda kept that specific gun for 20 years, after it had already killed a man in front of her own child. Most people who go through an experience like that, guilty or not, want the object associated with it gone. Keeping it, retrieving it from evidence storage after her acquittal, holding onto it through 2 decades and at least one more household in a different state, suggests either a genuine lack of the aversion most people would feel, or a level of comfort with that weapon that goes beyond ordinary self-defense reasoning. Either red is unsettling in its own way. And running underneath all of it is the uncomfortable core of both trials: a family that closed ranks around Linda Cooney twice, 20 years apart, with 2 different sons in 2 different roles. One as a child witness whose account happened to align with his mother's version of events, and one as an adult victim who spent years trying to talk himself, and everyone else, out of what his own body and the physical evidence had already confirmed. There's a broader question this case raises that goes beyond Linda Cooney specifically, and it's worth sitting with before we get to how it all ended. What does it actually take for a pattern like this to be recognized in real time, rather than pieced together only after a second shooting forces investigators to go back and connect it to the first? Kevin was 10 years old in 1992, testifying about a glary shine he couldn't quite identify, in a courtroom built around adult rules of evidence and adult standards of certainty. Nobody involved in that process was equipped to ask whether an 11-year-old's testimony might have been shaped, gently and repeatedly, by the only parent he had left standing in front of him every single day between the shooting and the trial. It's not a failure that belongs to any one person in the courtroom. It's a gap in how these systems are built, and it's a gap that, in this family, stayed open for 20 more years and one more shooting. Jim Cooney never got to watch his sons grow up. Kevin Cooney survived being shot by the same hands, and possibly the same gun logic that had already ended one life in his family, and he spent years afterward trying to protect the person prosecutors say pulled the trigger both times. Linda Cooney is currently serving a sentence of 13 to 40 years. The second time in her life a jury has had to decide what really happened in a room where she was the only adult present when a gun went off. If this case pulled you in, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. This channel is full of stories exactly like this. And before you go, drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts on this case. I read every single one. See you in the next video.